Hello everyone and welcome to Intellipaat. This video is a 4-part series of content related to Azure Data Engineer Associate Certification. A candidate for the Azure Data Engineer Associate Certification should have subject matter expertise in integrating, transforming and consolidating data from various structured and unstructured data systems into structures that are suitable for building analytics solution. This is the part 1 of the Azure Data Engineer video series. Now let us have a look at the agenda for this video. Firstly, I'll be explaining what exactly is Azure and followed by why use Azure. Finally, I'll be explaining some of the advantages of Azure over AWS. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon for regular updates.
Let's get started the session. So first let's talk about what is Azure. Now Azure is the cloud offering that we have from Microsoft. So Microsoft, being a very large organization, they have their cloud providing, which we call it as Azure. Now the typical definition of being an Azure is a cloud computing platform and an online portal to access and manage resources and services provided by Microsoft. So how it goes like this is, when we develop any kind of program or any kind of application, typically what we do is we have our on-premises systems, we have our applications installed. So we have Visual Studio, we have Power BI desktops and whatnot. We have SQL Server. So we have SQL Server Management Studio, we have Visual Studio. We log into that, we create our code and we deploy it and the code runs. Now, when we come to the new kind of technologies, which is a cloud offering where you don't need to rely on a hardware, you don't need to rely on any software. Yes, Visual Studio is typically required, but when I talk about the hardware things, you don't need any hardware. So Azure is a full-fledged cloud offering where you have a portal. So typically it's portal.azure.com. You log in there, you have all the services available and you can quickly create your code. Now, to understand Azure, let me give a little bit of background about the cloud technologies. So when we talk about cloud technologies, we categorize cloud offerings in 3 different ways. 1, platform as a service or PaaS. 2, infrastructure as a service or IaaS. And then software as a service or SaaS. Now, how do we differentiate between all these things? So PaaS is something where the product is available as a platform. You don't need to worry about any hardware. You just go ahead, spin up your platform and you start working on it. So typically, give you an example, when you're working with SQL Server, to work with SQL Server to write your query or create a database, you need to buy a SQL Server license. You need to have a machine where you need to install SQL Server, then only you can run your program. Now, when we talk about DB PaaS or database as a platform as a service on Azure, you can quickly log into the Azure portal. You can spin up a SQL Server logical server, and then you can create a physical database and you can just have the same experience that you have in a traditional SQL Server. But you don't have to bother about the infrastructure, you don't have to bother about the paging size, the admin work. All these things are taken care by Microsoft. So this is a platform as a service. When we talk about infrastructure as a service, what happens is, it's typical, the example is a virtual machine. When you're working in a platform as a service, you are basically creating a virtual machine. So that virtual machine is maintained by Microsoft. When you're creating a virtual machine, you can define what type of processor you want, what is the choice of OS that you want to have, how much RAM you want, what is the storage, do you want to use a hard disk drive, do you want to use a SSD. You can define all these things and you can create a virtual machine and you can work in that virtual machine. So that is infrastructure as a service. Now, when you talk about the third offering, that is SaaS or software as a service, this is a bundled product that is provided by the CSP. When I say CSP, CSP is nothing but the cloud service provider. So typical example would be the Microsoft 365 services. So you purchase a 365 license, you have your 365 server up and running, you assign the roles and the tenants part of that, and you have the people working and sending and receiving mails part of the 365 service. So that is a typical example of SaaS. So these are the 3 layers on which we differentiate all the services based on a cloud offering, not just Azure. You can go to Azure, you can go to AWS, you can go to GCP. These 3 remain same. Typically, when we talk about Azure, so how it happens is, you have a user. It can be anyone. It can be me, you, or anybody. They connect to the internet. They go to the Azure portal. So you have a typical user ID and password. You log into the Azure portal, and then you have access to all of these resources. So you can create a virtual machine, you can create a SQL database, you can create a data factory, you can create a Databricks cluster. Everything is there. You just need to click and set it up. That's it. You're good to start with Azure. So to give a little bit of more context, you can build, manage, and deploy applications on a massive global network using your preferred tools and framework. Set of cloud computing services to help your organization meet its business challenges. So there can be an n number of business cases. Typically, when you have a very small organization with a less capacity, you don't need to spend so much of money. So again, let me take a business case. So when we set up any kind of new organization, we take into consideration two things. One is capex, the other is opex. So capex is the capital expenditure and opex is the operational expenditure. So capex means whenever I'm setting up my business, I need to buy hardware, I need to buy software, I need to buy an office space, I need to buy internet routers and all these things. So these things comes into the capital expenditure, which typically before my business starts, I have to invest. Then comes the operational expenses or the OPEX. So in OPEX, what happens is when my business is running, I need to invest more and more money for my business to run. So I need to upgrade the licenses. I need to keep the software licenses running so that my business doesn't end. In this case, your capex becomes huge, but gradually that decreases, but the OPEX keeps on piling up. To solve these kinds of purposes, we have seen a lot of small organizations and startups, they are moving to the cloud infrastructure. They can go to a pay-as-you-go model where they just need to use the services for as long as they want, and they can continue their journey in the business. They don't need to shell out money beforehand. They don't have to block their resources. They can typically buy a pay-as-you-go license, and how much they need, they can consume that. Now, when we talk about the existing clients, the large organizations who already have an infrastructure ready, why they are moving to cloud. So the advantage of moving to a cloud is many. Again, the main factor comes into picture is the cost. When we move from a traditional on-premises system to a cloud-based solution, the cost becomes very minimal. And we have actually seen this in multiple projects. When we go for any kind of deals and when we give any kind of solutions, we of course have to give the pricing model. So we can see that from an on-premises system, when we move to cloud, it actually decreases the money in a very much way. It's a big factor that comes into the play. And also, taking into these things, we don't have to bother about the hardware. We don't have to bother about what type of machine I have. Do I have to install Linux or do I have to install Windows OS? We can create our applications, and based on my requirement, I can spin up an infrastructure and I can run. So to give an example, people who are from a .NET background, they will understand. So when you create any .NET application on premises, you need to set up your IIS server and deploy the code. Now, when it comes to Azure, we can create an app services plan. So that app services plan gives us the whole infrastructure required for my code to compile and run. I don't have to bother about anything. I can create an Azure function quickly. I can write my code, deploy that Azure function into that app services, and this is automatically taken care by Microsoft. We don't have to bother about any of the infrastructure. So you can create large scale applications without bothering about any of the bottlenecks. When I'm creating any kind of big data solution, so I'm working with Apache Spark or I'm working with Hadoop, so I don't have to set up my cluster. I don't have to maintain my cluster. I can quickly spin up a Databricks service. So when we go a little deeper, when we have a hands-on, we will see. So Databricks is a service that is available on Azure. You can just quickly create your Databricks service. You don't have to bother about any of the infrastructure. So the Spark cluster is maintained by Microsoft. You don't have to bother about any of the installation, anything. You can quickly run your code. And again, you can write your code in Python, R, Scala, Spark SQL, your choice of language. You can write your code, you can deploy it, and you're good to go. So life becomes pretty easy, both from a developer perspective and also from an operationalist perspective. So from the ops side, we don't need to maintain any kind of infrastructure. It is all managed by the CSP. We can bother about the code and how it is executing. So these are typical advantages of using a cloud-based solution from a legacy solution. There can be many things. Moving on. So why should we use Azure? Well, typically when we talk about any of the CSP, we have three main players in the market. we have Azure from Microsoft, we have AWS, the Amazon Web Services from Amazon, and we have GCP or Google Cloud Platform from Google. Now, when it comes to, there are also small cloud service providers also, but we typically talk about these three big players. Now, when we talk about these three players, Google is a little smaller compared to Azure and AWS, but Azure being a late starter in the market because AWS had an early runner advantage. They started with their cloud offering way before Microsoft started up with Azure. So let me give a little background. So when we started in 2010, Microsoft came out with something called as Windows Azure. So it was typically, it was very limited. It was very different from what we have currently as Microsoft Azure. So when Windows Azure was launched, it had very limited functionality. So it had SQL Server as a DB pass, it had Windows VM, it has .NET runtime. It was very limited. And Microsoft's approach to being a CSP was that we're going to leverage Windows and move people to the cloud. Eventually, that didn't work. And in 2014, Microsoft rebranded Windows Azure and Microsoft Azure was launched. Now, AWS was an early mover, so they had their cloud offering way before Windows Azure was available, and they gained a lot of traction. So Microsoft is a bit late in the market, but currently the trend that we see is that Azure is growing at a very rapid pace. Now, AWS still is the market leader, but Microsoft is catching up very, very fast. We have seen a lot of deals which are coming through where people are moving from on-premises to Azure. They are, and there are also use cases we have seen. There are clients who are currently AWS subscribers, but still they're moving to Azure. Now, the newer applications, they're moving to Azure. Their existing application, they're transforming to Azure. So there's a huge traction which we are seeing on Azure. Now, when we talk about Azure, we have a lot of data centers. So please keep this thing in mind. Microsoft really boasts about it. Microsoft has the largest data centers across the region. So this has 42 regions, but this grows over time. So these are just a couple of links. Let me open any one of them. So if you go to this link, you can see the infrastructure that Microsoft has. So you can currently see that they have 60 plus regions and 140 available countries. So no other CSP, AWS, GCP, they have no competition with Microsoft. Microsoft is by far the largest CSP, which has the largest data center across the world, and this is growing every day. So when we started, it was around, if I'm not wrong, it was around 40-45 data centers they had, but over the time they have grown so much. So they have lot of data centers. They are the largest data center that any CSP has in the world. And there's one more thing. Microsoft has a very big tie-up with the government agencies. I think there is a different link. I can share that with you. Microsoft has a very big tie-up with the government agencies. So Microsoft has special data centers dedicated for the governments. And these are something that you cannot access, but the other things you can access. So this is a big advantage for Microsoft. They are the largest data center provider across the world. Then let's talk about security. Now, this is a big factor, especially in a data engineering or a data analysis project. Whenever we talk about any of the clients, when we get an architecture or design an architecture, we see that the clients are very skeptic about their security. So they say that we don't want to expose our data to our outer network. We want to keep a couple of things on premises. We want to expose only this much of data. So this is a very typical architecture that we see coming from a lot of clients, that I want to be very careful when I'm handling with my data. So security is something that is very paramount when it comes to any CSP, because data is something that is very precious to everyone. And of course, when we are working on any cloud project, since we are working on internet, we have to be very careful because there can be attacks, there can be data breach. So how do we deal with this security? Well, Microsoft, I'm going to talk about mostly from an Azure perspective because there are other things that you can see in AWS and GCP. From Azure, we have different layers of security. So let me open up again another link. So this is the Azure security overview. And if you want to go in detail, you can go into the details. So typically what happens is Microsoft has different types of security in place. So when you talk about, let's take an example. Let's say that I have just created a subscription to my Azure portal and I want to set up a SQL DB. So how I can do that? So when we talk about networking, you can either create a dedicated channel via the cloud provider. So Microsoft has a dedicated tunnel that it creates via the ISP. So you have a dedicated network connecting to the Azure services, or you can flow your data over the internet. But please remember, when we are flowing the data over the internet, it again goes via an HTTPS channel. So it is never exposed to the internet. So when we talk about this, these are the typical things that we keep in mind when we are designing any of the secure applications. How the security will be, what are the security trainings we have to check. We have to check if we have the DDoS enabled. Of course, it should be disabled. And how do we work with security? So this is a very important part. And of course, Microsoft has Azure Monitor where you can see if there is anything. Azure Advisor, this is again a very important point. So when we create any kind of application on Azure, Microsoft gives you a recommendation. So they run their engine and they advise that you can do this. Azure Security Center, this is an important thing. If you go to Security Center, here you can see what are the threats that Microsoft detects. So if you create a SQL DB, Microsoft can give you a recommendation that I can see that these are the things you have in your system which you need to take care. So you can see all these things. When we talk about applications, how can you safeguard your applications? When you talk about storages, how can you safeguard your storages? So you have RBAC, you have SAS. When you talk about networking, again, there are different layers we can go. So we have NSG, or the network security group, using which we can secure our network. When you talk about compute, this is nothing but our virtual machines and all. So you can save your usernames and password in an Azure Key Vault, which is again encrypted. How do you save your identity? So you have multi-factor authentication, or MFA, you have Microsoft authentication, password policy, token-based application, RBAC or role-based access control, integrated identity. Based on all these factors, we set up our security. So typically when we set up any kind of security in the applications, we have good documentation from Microsoft. We have to keep up all these things in mind, and then we secure our applications. So this is from a security perspective. Then let's talk about scalability. So when we talk about scalability, this is something that becomes a bottleneck when we work in a typical on-premises system. So let me give you a very real-life example. So we have all faced this. So let's say that I'm working on a Spark cluster, or I have created a Hadoop cluster, which is on-premises. Now, when our application started, we came to a conclusion during the design phase that I'm going to set up my Hadoop cluster with this many core and this many nodes. This will be my hardware, and I start with my project. Now, over the course of time, I see that the cluster that I have created, it's not giving me that much of performance that I expected. So what we have to do, we have to go for scalability. Now, when we talk about scalability, we have two types of things. One is a vertical scalability, the other is a horizontal scalability. Now, a vertical scalability is a simple thing. We can increase the hardware. So we can increase the number of cores that we have in the processor. So we can move from a 16 core to a 32 core processor, and that will help us. And when we talk about horizontal scalability, we can increase the number of RAM. So maybe we have 128 gigs of RAM, we can go to 256 gigs of RAM. We can move from a hard disk to a SSD. But that again needs to involve a lot of cost. But when we talk about Azure platform, it is very simple. So let's say that the same thing, I have spin up a Spark cluster using a Databricks service. So I have started with a general purpose machine. We have 16 cores, we have 16 gigs of RAM, and my Spark code is running. And during our deployment or during our testing, we found that this is not giving us the performance that we need. So I don't have to bother about all these things. I don't need to go for a RAM update. I don't have to do any kind of core update. There is a drop down. In the drop down, I can just select from a general configuration. I can go to a memory optimized configuration. That's it. And Microsoft will take care of all these things at the background without having any manual intervention. We have the next generation or the next level of hardware resources available with us, and we are good to run with our code. So scalability is a fantastic thing on Azure platform, where it's just very simple. Very simply, we can scale up or scale down based on our requirement. Okay, there's something I should also mention, that is scale down. Now, let's say that we are working with a SQL data warehouse. Now, currently it has been rebranded to Azure Synapse. So we're working with Azure Synapse. Now Azure Synapse takes care of all our big data capability with a typical T-SQL infrastructure. So we can write a T-SQL statement, but at the back end, it will run a Spark code. So this is pretty expensive when this application runs. Now let's say that the client that we're working for, they don't need to run their Spark jobs 24/7. They need to run it maybe 10 times a day or maybe 15 times a day. So what will happen if I have my Synapse services running 24/7? That will incur a cost. So we can do something that is called as scale down. We don't need that much of resource. We don't need that much of service running for 24/7. So I can just turn it off and my scale down architecture is in place. So when my application is not running, I don't have to incur any cost. I'm not paying anything to the CSP. So I'm saving money, which is not possible in a typical on-premises system. Once you have invested your money, it is already invested. You cannot go back. If you use it or not, that's up to you. So scalability is a very good feature that we have on Azure, where you can scale up or scale down based on your requirement. Now let's move to the third thing, which is hybrid capability. So again, let me open up a link and I'll explain what is hybrid. So what is hybrid computing? This is a very good blog post that Microsoft has written, which has a very simple explanation to a hybrid system. So let me give you an example from a real life perspective. So this is something that we have worked in a project, and the client said that we want to move to cloud, we want to embrace Azure, but we don't want to move our servers to cloud, meaning they had couple of around 4 SQL databases which were on-premises databases, and they said that we don't want to move to DB so we don't want to use SQL Server as a service on cloud, but we want our .NET code to run on app services. We want our ETL SSIS to be replaced with Azure Data Factory, but we're not going to move our data on premises. So in this case, how do we work? So in this case, this hybrid solution comes into the picture. So what happens is when we talk about cloud, there can be two things, a public cloud or a private cloud. Public cloud means the resources are shared across multiple tenants. Now, please remember, when we talk about multiple tenants, it's not that if I am a customer, I can see the data of the other customer. No, that's not the case. It's how it happens is, I'll give a background how it works is. So typically when I purchase an Azure subscription, I get my Microsoft account on which I can log into the Azure portal and work. Typically, similarly, another customer B, they get their license, they purchase their license, and they get their Azure subscription. Now when I'm spinning up a virtual machine, this resource of the virtual machine is shared across multiple customers. There are security in place, so nothing is exposed, but the hardware is shared. So when Microsoft runs a data center, one data center resources are shared across multiple customers. That is something that happens in public cloud. But when we talk about private cloud, in private cloud, you have your dedicated network, you have your dedicated hardware. Nothing is shared across multiple customers. Now, what is a hybrid cloud? A hybrid cloud is a mixture of public cloud and private cloud. From a cost perspective, of course, since the hardware resources are shared across multiple customers, public cloud gives you less cost compared to a private cloud because this is a dedicated channel. Now, the scenario that I was talking about, when I am working with something which is on premises, something which is on cloud, this is another scenario where a hybrid cloud works. So there are use cases. When we move to Azure Data Factory, we will see how can we access something which is on premises, fetch the data and push it to a blob storage, for an example, to a blob storage, which is a cloud platform. So this is what a hybrid cloud is, and Azure does support hybrid cloud. And let's talk about flexibility. So flexibility, I don't think I have to explain. It's very simple. Flexibility is enormous. You have everything at your disposal. You can choose what type of service you want, what type of service you don't want, how much you want to pay, when you want to pay, when you want to use the service, when you don't want to use the service, when you want to scale up, when you want to scale down. Whenever you don't feel like working, you can just terminate the license and that's it. You're good to go. There is no problem in using. So you don't have to spend any kind of capital expenditure. Your operational expenditure is very less. So cloud gives you a lot of benefits. So these are just some of the best practices or good things that we have on Azure. Let's talk about advantages of Azure over AWS. So now let's move to Azure over AWS. So I give you a little bit of background about Azure and AWS. AWS, we have not talked about that, but AWS is also a very large CSP, and this is by far the biggest one when it comes to CSP. Now, organizations all over the world recognize Microsoft Azure over Amazon Web Services as the most trusted cloud for enterprise and hybrid infrastructure. Now, honestly speaking, what we see is that Microsoft has a very tight integration in the enterprise segment. Amazon being not that tightly coupled in the enterprise segment, they don't have that much of trust factor compared to Microsoft. So though AWS has an early mover advantage, Microsoft has caught up and they are giving a very tough competition to AWS. But from a real life perspective, of course, there are a lot of advantages that we have from Microsoft than AWS. Let me again open up a link. So this is a link where we can see why we have such advantages of Azure over AWS. So the first and the big thing that Microsoft has is the cost. AWS is almost 5 times more expensive than Azure when it comes to Windows Server and SQL Server. Azure matches AWS price for compatible services. Comparison between AWS offering and Azure offering. So to give you an example, when we talk about, let's say, SQL Server. So Microsoft SQL Server being a product of Microsoft itself, they have their cloud derivative available over Azure. But AWS also has support for different servers. When we talk about any open source systems, let's talk about, what can I say, MariaDB. So MariaDB is a service which is available in Microsoft Azure as well as in AWS. So all these things are very comparable. Now, Microsoft being a leader in the enterprise segment, all of Microsoft products, they give the clients an edge on pricing when compared to AWS. So this is a big advantage that a lot of enterprise segment customers are moving to Azure and choosing Azure over AWS. Use any open source OS, language, and tools on Azure. Azure made the most contributions to GitHub in 2017, and it is the only cloud with integrated support for Red Hat. Gone are the days of Microsoft being a very closed-ended company. After the arrival of Satya, Microsoft has opened itself and has contributed a whole lot to the open source community. And as you all know, Microsoft has bought GitHub, and that has been a big investment for them. They have bought LinkedIn and whatnot. So Microsoft has now support for a lot of open source systems. Just to give you a quick trivia, Windows is an operating system from Microsoft, but as per Microsoft documentation, as of today in 2020, 70% of the machines that Microsoft runs on Azure, they run on Linux and not on Windows. So Microsoft has made itself an open source company, mostly an open source company. Now, people who are from .NET background, they know that Microsoft has stopped the branch for development for .NET, and they have moved to .NET Core. .NET Core being the open source version, and they are now moving towards that. And all these things are happening in the open source community. So we have Azure Databricks, which is again an open source community. So Microsoft has invested heavily in the open source tool, and we have a lot of services on Azure which is targeted towards open source. And this line you can see Red Hat, which is the most popular enterprise Linux version that is there, that is only supported on Azure. It is not available on AWS. Again, this is the .NET one. So .NET, as we all know, this is a very, very popular runtime across the development board. And one of the reasons that Azure stands above AWS competition is the gladiatorial ring of cloud offering in its compatibility with the programming languages such as .NET. .NET has always been a very strong hold for Microsoft, and in the cloud segment also, Microsoft has made their offering available on the cloud platform with .NET. So we can quickly spin up an app services plan and we can host our .NET code there. And since Microsoft has invested so much in so much in open source, in the app services, you can write code in .NET, you can code in Python, you can code in Java. Everything is now supported since their VMs run on Linux now. Hybrid consistency is a key differentiator between AWS and Azure. You can hit the ground running if you choose Azure for your hybrid cloud requirements. Again, Hybrid cloud is something that Microsoft boasts of. They have the biggest data center across the world. So if you want to choose a public cloud or a private cloud, since they have the largest data center in the world, they have an edge over AWS. Okay, so this is just a little bit of background about Microsoft Azure, what kind of services we have, what is a cloud platform, what kind of things we have, how Microsoft is giving an edge over AWS.
Just a quick info, guys. If you want to make a career in data engineering, then Intellipaat provides an advanced certification in data engineering associated with MIT. This course is designed to upskill and land your dream job.